History does not always vanish in fire. Sometimes it simply stops being discussed. Across the United States in the 1800s, newspapers repeated the same strange line again and again. The remains were sent to the Smithsonian for further study. And then, silence. No published results, no measurements, no public records, no exhibits, just a one-way pipeline. Tonight, we follow that pipeline and ask one unsettling question. Where does knowledge go when it disappears? The scale of power. To understand the mystery, we must first understand the scale of the institution at the center of it. The Smithsonian Institution is the largest museum and research complex on Earth. It holds over 157 million artifacts, from fossils to human remains, cultural objects to historical records. But here's what most people never realize. Only about 1% of these items are on public display. The rest live in storage, locked facilities, controlled environments, restricted collections. One of the most secure of these locations is the Smithsonian Museum Support Center in Maryland, a vast complex housing anthropology collections, biological archives, and human remains. Access requires approval. Documentation is limited. The public rarely sees what enters. And once objects go in, the outside story often ends. The closed information system. There is another structural detail that makes the system unique. Most U.S. federal agencies are subject to the Freedom of Information Act, but the Smithsonian Institution operates under its own disclosure policies. That means the same institution that holds the evidence decides access to the evidence, controls the catalog, and publishes the conclusions. The pipeline, from discovery to interpretation, remains internal. And when control of evidence and narrative exist in the same structure, knowledge can be shaped quietly. The fire that broke the chain. But the trail becomes even harder to follow after one catastrophic event. On January 24, 1865, a devastating fire consumed much of the Smithsonian Castle. The blaze destroyed founding records, early correspondence, and intake logs documenting what had been collected during the institution's earliest years. From that moment forward, historical gaps became unavoidable. If researchers later asked what had been received, the answer could simply be, "We have no record." And without an independent ledger, there was no way to verify. The chain of accountability had been broken. The mound builder question. As the 19th century progressed, American archaeology became increasingly centralized. In 1879, the U.S. government created the Bureau of American Ethnology to study indigenous cultures and archaeological discoveries. It was led by explorer and geologist John Wesley Powell. One major focus was the mystery of the mound builders, ancient earthworks scattered across North America. Who built them? What civilization created them? Official investigations gradually moved toward a specific conclusion, that the mounds were constructed by ancestors of modern Native Americans. But critics argue the process revealed something else. The investigation itself defined what evidence was acceptable. Reports were written, edited, republished. Across editions, extraordinary descriptions sometimes became ordinary. Anomalies softened, measurements adjusted, interpretations narrowed. The excavations remained, but the narrative changed. And once published as official science, the conclusion became permanent. The authority of a gatekeeper. In the early 20th century, one figure would shape the institution's position on human remains for decades. Alice Hrdlicka, a physical anthropologist at the Smithsonian, became one of the most influential voices in American anthropology. He strongly rejected claims of unusually large human skeletons reported in earlier accounts. Under his influence, oversized skeletal reports were widely dismissed as misidentifications or exaggerations. But modern historians have examined another dimension of his legacy. His writings reflected beliefs connected to early 20th century eugenics. His collecting practices often involved human remains gathered without consent. And because his authority defined the institution's official position, his interpretations became a long-lasting filter, shaping what counted as legitimate evidence. When one voice defines the standard, alternative interpretations rarely survive. The pipeline effect. Step back and observe the full structure. Discoveries made in the field, objects sent to a central institution, records sometimes incomplete, access restricted,
interpretations controlled internally. Over time, a pattern emerges. Knowledge enters the system, but does not always return to the public. This is what some researchers call diffused knowledge. Information absorbed into institutional storage, where it gradually disappears from public awareness without dramatic suppression, simply through containment. No conspiracy required, just structure. Knowledge versus narrative. This story is not about secret vaults or cinematic mysteries. It is about institutional architecture. When the same system controls evidence, access, publication, interpretation, knowledge diffusion can become knowledge containment. And once that structure becomes normalized, reporting itself changes. Discoveries may still occur, but the public narrative stops at the same door. The remains were sent for study. End of story. The unanswered question. Today, millions of artifacts remain in storage. Countless records were lost to time. Interpretations shaped entire fields of study, and the pipeline continues to operate. The question is not what is hidden. The question is more subtle. What happens to knowledge when no one asks for its return? Where does information go when institutions absorb it faster than society can examine it? Where does evidence go when it disappears into systems designed to preserve it? And perhaps most importantly, who decides what history becomes real?